Welcome to Mokena's Front Porch, a Mokena history podcast with Matt Galick and me, Israel Smith.
Before the sale, the school's old iron bell, installed in 1881, and the work of Philadelphia's McShane Foundry, was removed from its tower and stored at Front Street's Village Hall. There it was held onto for safekeeping, with the news bulletin deeming that it may come in handy for future use. It is the legacy of hundreds of Mokena children who attended class in our town in the buoyant days after the end of the Civil War. For over half a century, the ornate, two-story Mokena Public School stood on the northwest corner of Front Street and today's Schoolhouse Road, a place that loomed large in the lives of generations of villagers.
All right, this episode, we're talking about the article that you wrote, Matt, you published on Saturday, August 5th, 2023.
Yeah, definitely.
And it was titled Reading, Writing, and Arithmetic, the Mokena Public Schools from 1872 to 1929.
Yes, yeah.
So, and just briefly, what is the significance of that time frame?
Yeah, well, those years, or the span of years between those two, was when the schoolhouse, the Mokena Schoolhouse, was in use. That stood on the, that would be the northwest corner of today's Front Street and Schoolhouse Road.
And you talk in the article how really at the time when that school was built, what we now know as Schoolhouse Road was really like a country road. I mean, it's at the edge of town.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
This was all kids walking to school largely, right? And people from the there in the community. Yeah. There were no school buses and things that going on at the time.
Definitely not yet.
So, and you continually hear this school referred to as, one of the grandest schools, one of the, greatest buildings or school buildings in Will County. And the pictures on the blog really do show what a cool building
it was. It was great.
This was. And, absolutely. A two-story with a grand, bell tower at the top and really neat building. And it's kind of hard to, with some of the pictures that you post, you kind of get the idea of where it sits, but there's so much change now. On that, it sits kind of where that yellow house is. Is that right? Yeah, more or less where the yellow house is. I don't think it maybe sat exactly in the footprint, because when you look at pictures of the schoolhouse, it looks like it was set back from the road a little bit. So maybe maybe the back was closer to First Street?
That's kind of the notion I'm getting, or that I've always gotten. Yeah, so it kind of sat on that corner, but between Front Street and First Street.
And so 1872, the school is built.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And at that time, what was the school system in Mokena looking like, high school wise?
Sure, yeah.
I know you covered a little bit. We'll get into an article, but
yeah. So in 1872, there wouldn't have been any high school to speak of. There was already a schoolhouse in town. So this schoolhouse, our schoolhouse here on the corner, was not the first one in town. There was a much smaller building that had stood that was built in 1855 for cost about $1,000 to build it when they built it. And it was a handsome little building, but it was nowhere near as big and as grandiose as this schoolhouse was. And it stood on what then was called the public square, which kind of, how to describe where that was or is. I never really went anywhere, but it would be the southern boundary of the public square would be 2nd Street, with the eastern boundary being Union Street, northern boundary being 3rd Street. And the western boundary would have been roughly where St. John's is nowadays, maybe a yard or two to the west of where St. John's Church is. This was a tract of ground that was set aside by our founding father, Allen Denny, in the 1850s, strictly to be used for schools and churches. And that's why St. John's is still there, because that's where they've always been, in that parcel of land somewhere. But this original schoolhouse, that was the first building built on the square when it opened in 1855, was stood, kind of tough to explain, kind of close to where St. John's is nowadays, but not exactly in the footprint. We could walk out there and we could stand right about where it was, but it doesn't neatly fit into the footprint of any building that's there nowadays, but kind of stood between where St. John's is now and where their Christian community center is. Kind of in that driveway, parking lot kind of area stood there. And interestingly, this building is still with us in town today, just not in its original location. St. John's Church, which then was called the German United Evangelical St. John's Church, purchased the building from the school board a few years after it went out of use, probably around 1875 or so. And they had it moved and tacked on to their parsonage, which stood on the south side of 3rd Street. And this old schoolhouse was used by St. John's as a schoolhouse for Sunday school and occasionally meetings and so on and so forth. And then in the 1920s, the schoolhouse was detached from the former parsonage building and rotated a little bit so that part of it fronted on 3rd Street, and so it sits today as a residence.
Sure, and that's the first house directly west of the parking lot.
Yeah, that's right.
Of Schoolhouse or of St. John's.
That's the one. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Interesting.
Yeah. One of the oldest houses in town because it's one of the few where we can actually affix its date of construction to it.
Wow.
With so many of the other really, really old ones, we only have kind of a rough estimate as to when it was built. But since that building was the schoolhouse and its history was very well documented, we know it was built in 1855. So,
and I don't know if you've ever been in that building or so we don't know if there's any remnants of the schoolhouse or the looks of.
Right. Yeah. Unfortunately, I've never been inside. I would absolutely love to. So if anybody out there knows the owners and would like to give us a tour, but I've been told, and this is going back a little bit, so this may not be the case anymore, but I was told back in the 90s, so 20 plus years ago, that the original wooden beams, the supports in the floor, were still visible in there from the basement. You could see them. So I don't know if they're still exposed or, they've been covered up over the years, but at least as of back then, they were still there.
And I know it's sold not too long ago.
That's right. Yeah.
There might be some pictures somewhere on the internet of that. But
yeah.
Interesting. So that was the first known school house in Mokena.
Yeah, that was the first schoolhouse in Mokena proper. Not counting the country schoolhouses that we had. But yeah, that was the first one. And our schoolhouse on Schoolhouse Road was the second new and improved schoolhouse.
And as you say, and as we've covered in previous episodes, that building still kind of lives on with other homes that were built from it, which, you'll talk about in the article.
Yeah, definitely.
Which is kind of interesting. I mean, it'd be neat to be able to walk through this beautiful building. But, as we hear, that was kind of a struggle too, or a fight in town of what happens with that building.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you talk in the very beginning a little bit, you mention some of the street names and how it relates to town and the founders and that. And so reading again the article, I thought, I see a lot of the street names around town and not always sure how they're related or if they're named after somebody.
Right.
So I had a short list. I thought we'd go through and see if you can shed any light. And if not, that's fine too.
Okay, yeah, we'll see.
So north the tracks, there's Cross Street.
Yep.
Right by St. John's there.
Absolutely. That's named after a gentleman by the name of Cyrus Cross, who was one of our early settlers. Not the first, but he was on the scene almost going back to day one. Came to us by way of Homer Township. I believe he was a born New Yorker, if I'm not mistaken. But he subdivided that little area along Cross Street that was originally part of Denny's addition to Mokena. But then a few years after Denny had laid out the town, Cyrus Cross bought that little chunk of it, and he then chopped it up further into lots. And the street just so happened to be named after him because it was his property.
I always thought it was maybe a connection to St. John's and a religious, but that makes sense too. Cross Street is one of my favorite streets to walk down around downtown. It's just a cute little street, neat houses on it.
Yeah, a lot of history on Cross Street. Absolutely.
All right. How about Carpenter Street?
Carpenter Street's another interesting one. Another early guy in Mokena's history. He was a contemporary to Alan Denny and Cyrus Cross. What's interesting about Carpenter Street, once again, we have a street named after a subdivision by the man who subdivided it. An early settler who came along, saw that Mokena was growing a little bit. The Rock Island had just come through. Alan Denny had subdivided, sold off some lots. People were building houses and businesses and stuff like that, as did John McGovney, Alan Denny's neighbor. However, or I should backtrack a little bit. So this is what Carpenter's doing too, over in that neck of the woods on Carpenter Street. But which Carpenter that street is named after is kind of foggy, because there were two carpenters who at that time were kind of wheeling and dealing in property speculation in Mokena back in the 1850s. And I've looked into the genealogy, and I believe these two men were brothers or cousins. There was Chauncey Carpenter, who I believe we talked about when we talked about Laura Teal's salon on Front Street. I believe he had a connection to the early history of that house. And was the other one, was that Norman Carpenter, I want to say? So it could have been named after either one of them, or both of them even, who knows?
Okay.
But yeah.
All right. And how about Parker Street?
Parker Street's another interesting one. It's kind of a mystery to me. It's kind of nebulous. A theory, an idea I have, maybe it was named after a local guy, Thomas P. Parker, who was a farmer, not really close to town. He was more out in the Town Line Road area, or what we now know as Town Line Road.
Which there's another Parker not far from there either.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I wondered if it could very well be named after the same family. But Thomas Parker volunteered in the Union Army during the Civil War and was ultimately killed at the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863. So I wondered, well, maybe it was named after him, but I'm not totally sure, because Parker Street wasn't platted, it wasn't laid out until well after Thomas Parker died. So he died in 1863. Parker Street was part of Benedict Marty's subdivision to Mokena, which he had laid out that must have been around 1904 or thereabouts. So there's quite a passage of time between Thomas Parker and the street coming along. So maybe, but I can't say with any definitive.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about Revere Road?
Revere, I've always just kind of thought that was named after, it was just somebody being patriotic, naming it after Paul Revere.
Yeah, okay. That's kind of what I was thinking, but you never know.
Yeah. I've never heard one way or the other, but that's what I always figured. I mean, I've never happened across any Reveres in Mokena's history.
Yeah, okay.
So I think it's just patriotism.
So we said, or if we had south of the tracks, a few more. Obviously, McGovney and Denny are two well-known street names. How about Cluth Drive?
Cluth, that's a good one. So Cluth Drive, more or less, not exactly, but pretty much follows what used to be a little farm lane that led west off of Wolf Road, back into where the end of the street is nowadays. There's a little kind of like a court at the end of the street. Right where that is and where those houses are, there was a little homestead that the Cluth sisters lived in. Oh. And they were, I believe, I know exactly who I could ask this question to get the definitive answer, but I believe the Cluths were relatives of the Sandrock family, who were pretty early settlers who lived at that same site. And the Cluth sisters lived for a pretty long time.
Any idea the time frame?
Well into the 20th century, post World War II.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but they were pretty old when they passed away, and they had it was a pretty rustic little homestead back there.
And were they like lived their whole lives in Mokena?
Once again, as always, I maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think they lived back there their whole lives, even though I'm pretty sure that property was in their family.
Okay.
Nevertheless, they lived there for a very long time. And up until somewhat recently, in the grand scheme of things, they still had family members living in town. But yeah, when that area, when that area was developed back there, they were remembered, and when that street was laid out, it basically more or less followed the little lane that went back to where they lived.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Named after them. Yeah, yeah.
How about Everett Lane?
Everett, that's named after Mr. Mike Everett, who was our mayor back in the 1980s, and he's still around.
Was a school board member up until recently.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he's still been involved in stuff around. And of course now, without having my details in front of me, I couldn't tell you what exactly his term was. I want to say he was in office as mayor from roughly 1982 or 83 until maybe 1989 or thereabouts. Maybe he's listening and he can correct us. But that time frame, for a good part of the 80s, he was mayor.
And Swanberg Lane.
Yep, Swanberg Lane is named after Charles Swanberg, Chuck Swanberg, who was another mayor. He was mayor back in the 1960s. Another guy who was just very civically minded, wore a lot of hats around town, was also very well known for being a businessman in town. He owned a farm implement dealership. Excuse me again. I believe he also sold some cars too. His business was down on Wolf Road, just north of LaPorte Road, on the western side of the street, where I believe, just right north of the post office. I think that's like a sign shop now.
Yeah, okay.
That's where Mr. Swanberg's business was.
Okay.
For many years, yeah.
And Scarth Lane, I think another mayor.
Yeah, right? Another mayor, yeah. A lot of those streets, or maybe it's just those three, thinking offhand, up in that Grassmere, I think the other subdivision's called Green Meadow. Like that neck of the woods, there were streets named after mayors. But yeah, Mr. Scarth was mayor from, let's see, I believe he was mayor in the 1950s. And a lot of Mokenians, I'm getting ahead of myself. He was, I believe he was one of the owners of the Mokena wallpaper mill. Okay. He wasn't the only one. There was a few guys who were, the owners together. In any case, he was running the wallpaper mill. So he was another big businessman.
Sure, okay.
In town.
And Shazar Drive in Foxborough Estates. Sure. That one I know is after Bob Shazar.
Yeah.
Former mayor who recently passed away.
Unfortunately, recently passed. Very nice man.
And I didn't know him. I got to hear more about him since he's passed, and he was a longtime Mokena Lion, and very civically involved.
Sure,
active with the Scouts, as well.
Yeah, he did a lot for Mokena, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, and that obviously in one of the newer subdivisions.
Yeah,
fewer mayors' names over there, and but he's one that made it, so that's great.
He did indeed.
And then the last one, how about Reagan Road?
That's another good one. So Reagan Road, it's kind of an interesting little area back there because technically that's New Lenox Township, but they might have Mokena addresses if I'm not mistaken. And it's sort of like right in the border, so a lot of people will consider that Mokena. But Mr. Reagan, this is not Ronald Reagan, the president. His first name's escaping me right now, but he was a very successful farmer in that area for many years.
Would he have farmed that area off of what's Reagan Road now?
Yes. Yeah, he did. Yeah,
okay.
He did. He had a name for his farm that was, if I'm not mistaken, it was named after one of the native tribes. Was it the Ojibwe farm, or it's buried in a file at home. I can dig it out. But yeah, he had a kind of like a romantic, poetic kind of name to his farm.
It's an interesting area down Reagan Road because you've got to the north from Reagan Road all the way to the highway. There's that big open field. A lot of people do some off-roading back there. That's now listed for sale. Oh, wow. We have Marshall Cemetery. And then those houses as you drive to Parker Road, beautiful big lots, great houses. You really are in the country there.
Oh, definitely.
So kind of a neat area. So.
It is. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, good. That's good to know. I did not know that was named after a local farmer.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Good. Well, this is a really interesting article. We've talked about the Mokena schools before a little bit, not in any way as in depth as this article gets. We've talked about Mamie Beckstein. We had the recording we got from Dr. Cohen and the school district there. Again, really interesting. The pictures are awesome. We'll be sure to share these on Facebook, but as well as the link to Matt's blog here.
Thank you.
I think it's a neat to note that the bell that sat on top of there is still around.
Yep.
We can still go see it at MES. Behind Mokena Elementary School, and hopefully for a long time to come.
I hope so. The names of our village's roads are a peek into our history. Some bear the names of founding fathers, such as Denny Avenue and McGovney Street, while others recall mayors, such as Everett Lane and Swanberg Lane. After all, the name of Wolf Road, originally a Potawatomi path, harkens back to none other than Thikaki Tayanaki, or their word for Trail of the Wolf through the wonderful land. Schoolhouse Road also makes an appearance, not only being one of our main thoroughfares, but also taking its name from a local institution of many years standing. However, in our fast-paced 21st century world, how many modern Mokenians actually reflect on the place from which the road gains its namesake? For over half a century, the ornate, two-story Mokena Public School stood on the northwest corner of Front Street and today's Schoolhouse Road, a place that loomed large in the lives of generations of villagers. While it was the grandest school in our history, it was far from the first, that honorable designation going to the schoolhouse that was the inaugural building constructed on our public square in 1855, 3 years after the arrival of the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. A small, low-slung Greek Revival building boasting of one classroom, lightning rod, and modest bell. It also served as a meeting place for Mokena's newly formed religious congregations and whoever else needed the space. By the time the Civil War ended in 1865, the 10-year-old building was already bursting at the seams with students. It was time to upgrade, and mirroring the up-and-at-them post-war mood in our neck of the woods at the time, no expense was spared. On the edge of town, at the northwest corner of Front Street and today's Schoolhouse Road, then an unnamed farm lane, a magnificent two-story wooden eminence began to grow. Built under the leadership of local contractor and native Englishman James B. Eason and the assistance of carpenter George Schweizer, the new school bore touches of Italianate architecture, then in vogue in this part of the state, with the elaborate brackets supporting the roof and window frames, complete with its bell tower standing triumphant, which before the completion of our first water tower in 1898 was the highest point in town. All in all, the new structure measured in at 45 by 78 feet. Inside, 2 sets of winding stairs led down from the second floor. The meat of the structure were its 2 large classrooms, one upstairs and one down, each measuring in at 20 by 60 feet. 2 round wooden pillars supported the ceiling in each room, although in later years more walls would be built to subdivide each room. By the time construction was complete, the final cost of the new school plus its furnishings came out at $10,000. In those early years, it was widely considered to be one of the crown jewels of Will County's school system. Only 5 years after its opening, eminent Will County historian George Woodruff stated that it is a flourishing school, ably managed and well attended. Well, years later, The Mokena News Bulletin humbly wrote that it was the talk of the town and surrounding country in its day. So acute was the need for the new building that it was in use before it was even finished, with the ground floor being open for students in the fall of 1872, while the second was still under construction. When the doors first opened, none other than George Kimball was one of the first pupils, who would be remembered as the real bad boy of the school. He was an orphan who lived with the Brumand family south of town, and he was said to have been a great tobacco chewer and could spit the farthest of any boy. Through the muddle of time, it is agreed that Professor Harris Smith was the new school's first principal, a man whose life in Mokena's history remains nebulous at this late date. Who the other firsts were leaves room for debate. Whenever the subject came up in the decades thereafter, memories were fuzzy. However, it can be certain that Miss Sarah Baldwin, Miss Sarah Mather, Miss Clara Williams, Mr. and Mrs. Buck, Mr. Harrower, and Mr. Rulison were all there in the early days, although the first names of the latter educators are long since lost to the ages. In the beginning, the stately school housed grades 1 through 8, while around 1908 the passing of a state law proved fortuitous to local pupils. The long and short of it provided the rural students' home school district to pay tuition for a high school of choice, thus opening the door to a high school education in a time and place when young Mokenians would not normally have had it. Some village youth took advantage and commuted by train to Blue Island in this era, a stretch further down the Rock Island. At this time, most of these pupils were girls, as local boys were needed to do farm work. A little later, Mokena's own 2-year high school was rung in 1913, under the leadership of Professor S.J. Eakley, an accredited chemist. Holding class in the Front Street building, a 3rd year was added to the high school in a period of prosperity, having existed in the blink of an eye from 1925 to 1927. In this inaugural year, these upper classes counted 9 students, to which another teacher was added, bringing the total number of educators in the bygone school to 5. For many in the village, their day began with the 8:30 tolling of the school's bell, which could be heard anywhere in Mokena. Pealing around 8 to 10 times, townfolk grew accustomed to hearing it and would even set their clocks to it. Mamie Beckstein, member of a well-known local family who served as principal at the school from 1910 to 1912, painted a vivid picture of the bell. Years later, she would describe feeling its weight when she pulled the inch-thick rope that came down from the school ceiling that took quite a jerk to set into action. As the day came to life, all pupils walked to school, some coming from as far as 2 miles away. On rainy days, those who marched over the muddy rural roads to get to school were allowed to take their boots off and wear house slippers inside. At 9 o'clock, the day officially started, which was heralded with 3 or 4 more strokes of the bell. The 5th through 8th grades held court in the upstairs classroom, which had space for about 60 students, while the room on the main floor had space for 50 children of the lower grades. Each classroom had a platform upon which the teacher's desk stood, with bench seats being available for the pupils, who came to the front of the room to recite their studies. Unlike today, there was no organized lunch system at the school, with the children bringing what they could on their own. Mamie Beckstein remembered that some brought it in buckets and some brought it in their pockets, with some of the farm children often bringing a chicken leg and homemade bread. The spacious building on the corner was heated entirely with coal, the ashes of which would be dumped in the road. A janitor was employed whose job it was to build the fires, although throughout the day the teachers would add to it from lumps of coal in buckets. The coal was originally stored in the school's basement, but later on a storage building was put up on the west side of the grounds, which decades later was moved and turned into a small residence just west of town on Francis Road. Running water inside the school was a luxury that could only be dreamt of. There was a shallow well on the property, water from which was blamed for an outbreak of the grip which swept through the school in early 1911, and was also the root of rumors a year later that it was causing jaundice. So powerful was the innuendo that local hardware merchant and school board member William Needhammer had a sample of the stuff tested by 2 separate laboratories in Chicago, who pronounced it safe to drink. As it was, the well was also known to be finicky, not to mention the fact that older students had to help the younger ones operate the stiff pump. So many of the pupils brought their own tin cups that they filled at the John Erickson family hand pump just across today's Schoolhouse Road. On a normal day, an early recess would be had from 10:30 to 10:45, with more ringing from the regal bell. Girls had ample space to play crack the whip, while boys would play baseball, which led to the occasional problem of a ball flying across the Rock Island tracks and being unretrievable due to traffic on the railroad. Around the turn of the 20th century, boys would also play shinny, an informal kind of hockey. Nevertheless, casualties mounted, and the powers at the school came to find the game too rough and dangerous, which ultimately led the school board to ban it in November 1910. Bill Semler, our correspondent to the Joliet Weekly News, carried the word in his Mokena column, to which the editor chipped in, what a wealth of memories the game of shinny brings forth. Who has not landed in the game in time to get the battered tin can in the face, or the hickory club in the shins? Better call it golf and let the lads have all they want of it, so long as the teacher keeps out of harm's way.
So, real quick, it sounds like a brutal game.
Yeah, it definitely does. Yeah,
Enough that the school board stepped in and said, no more.
Right, exactly.
Interesting. So, you mentioned about the John Erickson family, then John Erickson farm across Schoolhouse Road.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, is that the same farm and building that's still there today?
Yep, that's the same.
Wow.
That's the same one, yeah.
And how long has that farm been there?
It's very, very old. The farmhouse, probably, and this is a prime example of what we were saying in the earlier part of the episode. We don't have an exact date of construction, but based on the little elements of its architecture that you can kind of recognize and pick out, I would reckon the house being built probably not too long after the Civil War.
Wow.
So it's been around. I can say for a fact it was already there in 1873 because there is a lithograph of another farm in town. And as the artist put it together, he kind of sketched what was around the farm. And in the background, you can see what was later known as the Erickson farm.
Wow.
And that was 1873. So probably was pretty new at that point.
And did they have children going to the school at that time?
That I'm not sure of. They
otherwise they just had all these school kids coming over and using their well.
The John Erickson family did have children. Let's see, their son was Charles Erickson, who was became an auctioneer in town, a farmer himself, a pretty well-known guy. He must have been born around 1884 or 1885. So when did they acquire? I can't remember right offhand when exactly the John Ericksons bought that farm. I'm kind of thinking their son Charles did not go to school there. Once again, maybe I'm wrong, but just kind of thinking and trying to do the math real quick in my head. I want to say they moved in around the early 1900s, but in any case, Mr. and Mrs. Erickson would have been used to having lots of kids around coming in to use the hand pump on their well. And after a day's learning, the pupils would gather their books and head home at 4 o'clock, with 2 or 3 more strokes of the bell. Aside from the drudgery of their studies, the school could be a lighthearted place. Pupils were known to slide down the black walnut railing of the building's staircase, and music was supplied by a Julius Bauer piano installed in the upstairs room in the spring of 1911, paid for by 2 plays staged by the students. Not to be outdone, 11 years later in the spring of 1922, 2 Victrola phonographs were purchased for the school, an improvement which the News Bulletin hailed as never dreamed of. At the same time, new playground equipment was put up, consisting of teeter-totters, slides, and the like, the cost of which was footed by dozens of Mokenians who helped raise the money. In describing these new niceties, the news bulletin proudly stated that more improvements have been made this fall than have been made in the last 20 years. Nevertheless, as nice as the new playground was, it could also be a risky place. In the spring of 1927, an unimaginable accident befell 10-year-old Iris Hamilton when, in using the slide, a long, jagged sliver of wood drove itself into her leg. The school's principal, Professor Clarence Uhl, was quickly on the scene and, hastily determining that 2 arteries had been cut, stanched the flow of blood by pressing his thumbs against them. Iris was transported to Front Street's Cooper and Hostard Ford Agency with the sliver still in her leg until professional medical help arrived 45 minutes later. The news bulletin monitored the happenings closely and stated that the quick action and thought of Professor Uhl was the only factor that prevented the child from bleeding to death, and his many friends here say he is worthy of a Carnegie Medal for saving a life. The pupils at the Mokena school were generally happy. However, an incident from 1913 stands as a stark contrast on the record of the years. In February of that year, the halls of learning came nigh being the scene of a strike, when some of the students threatened to walk out and not come back until their complaints were taken seriously. The scholars told their parents of petty annoyances and bristled at what they thought was discipline that was too strict. In many cases, the parents backed up their children. Luckily for all, cooler heads prevailed and the trouble was smoothed out. Mokenian Bill Semler, our village's correspondent to the Joliet Weekly News, was of the opinion that overindulgent parents were to blame, writing that overfond parents are often a hindrance to the welfare of a child, and such parents cannot see the faults of a child as well as a teacher can, and that when tales of petty annoyances are told at home, parents should investigate ere giving the child their opinion. A similar incident occurred at the end of the 1917 school year, when some of the high schoolers, in their class publication, The Blab, raked the Board of Education's members over the coals. Bones of contention were the aforementioned pump and the lack of running water in the school, the fact that the entire building had yet to be electrified, with the honor only belonging to the upper room at that point, and the absence of screens in the school's windows. A defender of the board rallied to their aid, and in the latter point retorted that an epidemic hasn't yet made apparent of screening the rooms to protect the children against the flies that swarm there during the fall months. Going on, this individual said that the Blab's comments were entirely uncalled for, and the paper should be discontinued for its sarcastic remarks. So it was that pupils occasionally had grievances against the school's leadership. On the other side of the coin, for a good span of the building's life, punishment was dealt out with a rod and switch. In Florence Pittman's seminal 1963 work, The Story of Mokena, she recalled that, in the 90s, it was the universal policy of parents to start their children to school with the admonishment, if you get a whipping at school, you will get another when you get home. Nevertheless, there was a limit. As far back as the spring of 1874, when the school on the corner was a brand new structure, Professor Harris Smith, the school's first principal, landed himself in trouble for dealing out chastisement that was a touch too heavy-handed. He struck a small boy with a hickory whip stock for refusing to get a scuttle of coal, to which the Joliet Republican snidely remarked, that strictness cost him the little sum of $25, or the equivalent of about $665 in today's money. As it were, Smith was not a popular man in Mokena, the same paper's town correspondent a few weeks later penning that, Mokena has one of the finest school buildings in the county. It is wished that we had half as fine a principal to run it. Well, going on that, the man who tries to run it now says, if you don't like my style, keep your children at home. Our local writer estimated that 2/3 of Mokena's parents were doing just that. In addition to being a house of learning, the school also served as a community showcase, with countless entertainments being given there over the decades. Typical was the exhibition given on Saturday evening, February 24th, 1883. The weather that night was less than ideal, but Mokeneans braved the muddy roads and turned out in full force. Music was supplied by the Mokena Cornet Band, backed up by Mrs. N. Enders and Miss Lizzie Brumand on the organ. An opening song was given by the school, followed by various recitations, readings, and dramatic pieces, such as Johnny Shrimp's Idea of Amusements, Watermelon Pickles, and a pantomime called A Temperance Story, all of which were put on by the students and teachers. When a final tableau titled Comfort was due to be framed, school directors John A. Hatch, George Schweizer, and Robert H. Turner were called to the stage, where they thought they were being asked to speechify. Much to their surprise, it turned out they would be taking part in the tableau. An elegant chair was placed for each of them on the stage, each one a gift from the teacher and students, thanking them for their kindness and interest manifested in making things comfortable for them. One who was there said that the three men were so overcome they could not find words to express their gratitude. When all was said and done, the proceeds netted from the night's festivities were $25.75, or around $835 in modern funds. Alas, the good old days weren't always good, as is demonstrated by a peculiar incident that occurred in the fall of 1908. On Wednesday morning, October 14th, 12-year-old Viola Hanson opened the schoolhouse doors and went upstairs by herself. Upon doing so, she happened upon a strange, unknown man lying on a bench in a side room next to the library. She thought he appeared to be asleep, but couldn't be sure. Viola was thoroughly shaken up by her discovery and sprinted back to her front street home, and when others came to investigate, the stranger was gone. It was gathered that he gained entrance to the building through a downstairs window. The school was also subject to extreme temperatures during the more inhospitable months. For most of the building's history, it had no central heat to speak of, with warmth being provided by 2 coal-burning stoves in each room. Local sage Clinton Krause would recall that he and his fellow students in pre-World War I days would gather around the stoves and study, with the best-case scenario being that the pupils near them would be in torrid heat, while those farther away would freeze. Such was life until 1911, when the school board had a state-of-the-art heating system installed, being the first school in Will County to be so equipped. On the other hand, air conditioning was still decades away, and is something the school would never boast of. At the beginning of the school year in 1893, an unlucky combustion of coal stored in the basement ignited a fire that caused quite a little excitement for a time. Luckily, things were quickly brought back under control, and the flames made no serious headway, but nevertheless, the starkness of the situation was lost on no one. Talking to the Joliet Republican, Mokena village leader Isaias McGovney grimly said that if the fire had gone unchecked, the whole building would have been lost. Flames again reared their uninvited head on a school day in the winter of 1922, when on February 6th, the ashes in an overheated stove set the floor of the upstairs room ablaze. Pupils were marched into the cold outdoors, some of whom purportedly were unaware a fire was happening, and the flooring torn up, once again preventing a small fire from becoming a serious one. Indeed, concern over fires was a deep one for the school board. After the infamous inferno at Collingwood, Ohio in March 1908, it was resolved that a fire escape would be built on the exterior of the aging structure, and by the following August, a Joliet concern had finished the steel stairs. The school's main doors facing Front Street were also fixed. Now they opened outward instead of inward, which to that point had been the case. When the first official fire drill was carried out toward the end of 1910, the pupils expertly used the escape, even though a few of them felt some initial trepidation.
So fire again, which kind of has been a theme throughout Mokena in its early days.
Absolutely.
Fortunately, they were able to catch this.
Yeah, definitely.
But you mentioned the infamous inferno at Collingwood, Ohio in March of 1908. Can you just share a little bit? Do you know about that?
Yeah, a little bit. I'm not intimately familiar with the event, but after having heard of it in accounts from back then, I had never heard of it and wanted to find out more. So I looked around online a little bit, and apparently that was a fire in a school in this place, Collingwood, Ohio, where a lot of students died.
Really?
Like, it was this really tragic, horrible event, and the whole thing could have been prevented if they had adequate fire precautions in place. So
that probably kind of rang out across the country as kind of a warning sign that they needed to take some precautions.
Yeah, that's the impression I got. Yeah, the Mokena School Board was pretty shook up about it, which then led to them having this fire escape built and the doors fixed and
the doors. I mean, that's something you don't think about. They had to reverse the doors, so the doors are going out and stuff, which is now a more commonplace thing, but.
Right. Yeah,
interesting. And the first fire drill was held at the end of 1910.
Yeah,
you mentioned. So,
yeah, definitely.
So Mokena teachers have been doing fire drills for about 113 years.
Oh yeah, very long time. I remember doing them at Mokena schools too. So.
Sure.
As the decades came and went, and life went on in Mokena, the school was beginning to show its age. By July 1922, the House of Learning had sagged to such a degree that an architect from the county seat was called out, who was greatly alarmed at the way the stone foundation on the east side of the building had bulged outward. To remedy this, it was recommended that 21 concrete piers, each 3 feet square, be built underneath the school. Alas, it was only a temporary fix. As the decade progressed, talk in town heated up about constructing a new school, and after 57 years of serving Mokena's youth, the grand old landmark was ready to be taken out to pasture. The last classes were held here in June 1929, the same year the new school on Carpenter Street opened, which now serves the community as our city hall. Pupils were happy to make the move, with one being exuberant about getting to the new schoolhouse away from the noise of the railroad, where we will have more room to play. So it was that America plunged into the Great Depression, and the grand old school sat vacant for the next 4 years, during which time conjecture swirled about its future. At Christmas time 1933, Will County Superintendent of Schools and Mokena native August Maui advised our school board to let it stand, citing his experience that in every district in which the old schoolhouse was sold or torn down has been that very soon thereafter the building was needed for regular school purposes. In the spring of 1934, the question was posed to Mokenians during the annual school election as to whether the building should be sold or not. The village's news bulletin was firmly in the former camp, writing that the place was abandoned and facing ruin, and that the community would be better off with the school board profiting from the sale of the property. The election came, and Mokena's voters gave the green light for the building to be sold at auction on Tuesday, May 15th. Before the sale, the school's old iron bell, installed in 1881, and the work of Philadelphia's McShane Foundry, was removed from its tower and stored at Front Street's Village Hall. There it was held onto for safekeeping, with the news bulletin deeming that it may come in handy for future use. As the sales calls were cried and bids cast into the air on that spring day, Lester Sheik came out as the winner, beating out everyone else by offering $325 for the old school. Sheik will be known to listeners as Mokena's genial dairyman, who was also a member of the school's first high school graduating class in 1914. Incidentally, one of the school's outhouses was sold to J.M. Yunker for $5, and the other to Ed Marshall for $7.50. Teaming up with his brother-in-law Byron Nelson, Lester Sheik set about to disassemble the landmark at the end of May 1934. The two men were of an admirable generation that didn't waste, and set forth to use the school's robust lumber, of which it was reckoned there was at least 3 boxcars worth, and just as good today as the day it was first used, to build some new houses in town. This author is aware of at least 6 houses in Mokena, including his own on Midland Avenue, that claim to come from school lumber. Alas, with the unmerciful passage of time, it is impossible to verify which claims are authentic. The deconstruction of the school turned out to be a veritable trip down memory lane. When the blackboards were taken out in the spring of 1929, the back of one of them was found to be covered with writing bearing the date September 21st, 1902. On it were enumerated the names of the Board of Education, to wit, Christian Beckstein, Simon Hohenstein, and Irwin McGovney, as well as teachers W.J. Cunningham and Leah Smith, not to mention carpenters J. Bigger and Charles Maui, indicating that the moment preserved in time must have taken place during a renovation project. As the walls came down bit by bit, a book on grape growing published in 1850 was discovered between them, as was also a hammer with a broken handle, lost by some ancient workmen. Incidentally, the process of taking apart the old school was helped along by what was deemed a baby twister, which struck town in early July. Shingles, laths, and pieces of lumber were described as flying through the air, all of which sent Byron Nelson running south of the Rock Island tracks to the Conoco oil station for shelter. The work was completed in the last week of July 1934, with our news bulletin heralding on its front page that the old Mokena School is a thing of the past. While those venerated halls of education have long since disappeared from our landscape, their legacy lives on in some very tangible, everyday ways, such as the road named after the school and the houses built from it, all of whom are just as sturdy now as the day the school first went up in 1872. Not to be forgotten, however, is the fact that the school's erstwhile bell, a very important part of life in the Mokena of our forefathers, still remains here in town and can be readily visited. As the years went on, the old bell made its way to the fire department, who trooped it out occasionally on parades. In 1979, the bell was rediscovered in our midst, and as the 1980s carried on, interest in the historic relic bloomed. School Superintendent Ray Garitano came up with a plan to build a new bell tower in town, much in the style of the old schools, and after a period of brainstorming, the bell and its new home were officially dedicated on September 12, 1985, to the students past, present, and future of Mokena Public School. Thus the bell, whose strain had echoed over the rooftops of the village for decades, was given a new place of honor on a sunny knoll between the library and the schools. A neat ceremony was held, complete with the Pledge of Allegiance led by Craig Yunker, the recitation of the Eleanor Fairjohn poem School Bell by Amy Danielowicz, and releasing of balloons by third grade students. The bell still reposes there to this day, a small piece of one of the grandest schools Will County ever knew. It is the legacy of hundreds of Mokena children who attended class in our town in the buoyant days after the end of the Civil War, spanning the years until just before the start of the Great Depression. Their ways of life are today but a distant memory, almost lost in the haze of time. May this August iron bell serve as a permanent reminder of their stories.
Wow, how cool that bell is still around and still on display for us to see.
Yeah, I love it.
So you said the last classes in the old school were held in June of 1929.
Yes.
That is and then true. The property or the school is taken apart, as you said.
Yeah.
Do you know when the land was sold or when anything else? The next, I assume the house that's there now was the next building that was there. Or?
Yeah, that is true. The as it's known around town, the Yellow House was the next building built after the school. However, it came along quite a long time after the school was taken down. That property on the corner was vacant for many, many, many years. The house has always been there in my lifetime, but it's definitely a post World War II construction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Strange that lot would just sit empty when maybe it was the time. I mean, we talk about the Great Depression at a time, but
yeah.
With Mokena developing and downtown being very active at the time.
Yeah.
It's strange that something wouldn't have happened earlier, but
yeah. I'm not sure as to why that is. I'm sure there was a reason. But yeah, why it just kind of sat there for so long. That I'm not sure.
And you mentioned the 6 homes that you believed were all built from the lumber. Are all of those on Midland, or are there some other places?
That's a good question. So let's see here. Going through them in my head, most of them are on Midland. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I can think of offhand right now. I can think of 4 on Midland Avenue between Carpenter Street going north to Parker Street. Then there's another home on Wolf Road, a little ways south of Revere on the they'd be the east side of the road across from Wolf Point condominiums. There's another house on the corner of the northern side of the corner of Midland and Parker. Thinking of Parker and Carpenter. That was also said to have been built out of Schoolhouse lumber and building materials. And all of these houses are totally possible because they all were built right in that era, like the 1930s, around the time the original Schoolhouse came down. But there's just no way to verify it. It's just stuff. We have these houses identified just because it's been passed down in Mokena lore over the years that this house and that house were built out of school lumber.
So, do you know, did they have any connection to those lots, or do they own that property already down Midland? Do you know? Or
yeah, no, I don't. Unfortunately, I do know that, for example, the house I currently live in on Midland Avenue. I like to believe it's an authentic school lumber house because we do know for a fact that Lester Sheik built the house, and he at the same time was owning the schoolhouse and was taking it apart. So it makes sense that he was just moving the stuff from one piece of property in town to the next to build from it. But yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, that I'm not sure of.
Yeah, and I thought it was interesting you talk about this, how they were excited about the school moving away from the tracks.
Yeah.
And you think, that's a lot of noise.
Oh,
and especially for kids, I'm sure they were, every time a train went by, they were staring out the window and not paying attention to the teacher.
Yeah, right. I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah, so that very interesting. And again, we mentioned Mamie Beckstein, who's principal from 1910 to 1912. Yeah, really interesting. It's interesting to see the schools and the school system progress.
It is
so much. I mean, think about, they don't have screens on their windows, and there's live embers flying around from compared to what our kids have now is a vast difference and major improvement in a lot of ways.
It is complete, total night and day difference in what the Mokenians of yore were experiencing when they were going to school.
Yeah, I mean, the commitment of these teachers. Yeah. I mean, being a teacher today, I can't imagine. But
me neither. Yeah.
In a day when you're dealing with so much. It's amazing that we had so many people that were willing to do it, and this is a great story, Matt. Anything else that you want to add before we close?
Just other than that, this was one I really particularly enjoyed writing and gathering all the material for, and kind of making it into a narrative. Because it's a really great story. Like I was saying, that really kind of illustrates what life was like for Mokenans over a century ago.
Yeah.
So
and cool. I think we're gonna have a few more things about the school, the bell, the playscape now that's at MES. I thought it was you mentioned about how families and parents and that raised money back in 1922 for the new playground and that, and it just reminded me of the same a similar effort that took place to build that playscape, the wooden playscape there. That's
exactly the same.
So
thing.
Many people are passionate about and care about.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Unfortunately, the tragedy that happened with the young girl and the cutting herself in this story.
Yeah, it was crazy.
After kind of changes the tone a little bit, but it's neat to see. Like schools are always a place where community comes together, fundraisers, things like that. So,
absolutely.
Again, really neat to see, and I look forward to hearing more about the bell and and what the school's going to be doing with that going forward as well. So.
Definitely.
Well, great, Matt. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great story. We'll share, like I said, as always, the link to the blog post, the photos, all that on our Facebook and show notes. So check those out. Thanks, Matt. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're enjoying our show, it would really help us out a lot if you would leave us a rating and a review, especially on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. There's a link in the show notes to Matt's blog article that this episode was based on, so be sure to check that out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Mokena's Front Porch.